Guys, some people know me as Sister Vekuchuka ku TikTok, and others know me as Sister Vekugadzirama video. From wherever you're coming from, I'm happy that you're here, and thank you so much for joining me in this special, which is a happy birthday Nyashaà special. This past week, I celebrated my birthday. If you're watching this, like when it's fresh, if you're watching this in March, I've just come in from celebrating my birthday. And if you know me, you know I like to travel and just spend that week just commemorating all the goodness that has happened in that year and looking forward to the new year. This year, to add on to that, I would like to dedicate this episode to my first female friendship. And why I would like to do that is because if you watch the previous episodes, Happy Galentine's Day, we speak on female friendships and we're celebrating them. So I just thought it would be a natural progression to go from there and celebrating the woman who brought me earthside, my mother. So I'm dedicating this episode to her. Auxilia passed away in 2017, so it's been about 9 years now. But now that I am 37 and have had time to reflect on some things, gone through a whole lot more life from that time, there's a lot of things that I would blame her for, that I would feel that she didn't do as well as I would have wanted her to. And if you watch the previous episode, my cousin speaks on that, on how at some point you start to view your parents as human beings. And I think dedicating this episode to her is in a way for me to redeem part of our relationship that I've always looked at a certain way because of certain misgivings and how possibly I judged her as a parent versus as a human being, and mostly versus as a woman. I met my mom on 5 March 1989. I obviously don't remember that day, but she does. And I think that's one of the big reasons why I would love to dedicate this episode to her, because I think mothers remember more of that space than we do. The one thing that happened with my mom is that from the time I was possibly born to maybe around 11, 12, we lived together as what would be a typical family unit. And when my parents' marriage disintegrated and eventually ISAP and a whole lot of other things hit in Zimbabwe, in 2000, my mom moved to the United Kingdom. I am part of what's called a diaspora orphan, where for a set number of years, you just didn't have your parents in that space. And so you didn't have that typical parenting that someone would have if their parents were there. And so she left when I was 12 and came back to Zimbabwe when I was 24. And at that time, that accounted for half my life. Adding on to already strains that I already felt were there, that distance put in an added distance to it. I remember a time where, because we didn't have cell phones the way we have them in the time we have now, you used to have calling cards from the UK, and I remember they used to buy them for £5 and they would call, and then by the time it's on a phone and everybody gets to speak to someone. And I was a boarder, and you know, at boarding school, we didn't have cell phones then. So if you had a telephone booth at your school, you could make calls and call people at home. Now imagine trying to make an international call. So I remember there was a time where we kept missing each other to the extent where I actually didn't speak to her for 3 years. And so by the time she passed away in 2017, I remember thinking that this is not going to be the longest I haven't spoken to her. So the first couple of months of her passing weren't particularly odd because I was accustomed to not speaking to her as much. I know some people may not relate with this because typically people tend to have relationships with their moms where they speak constantly. And I know even coming into this episode, if there are people within my life there where we've had this conversation before, may feel a way about how I'm going to discuss some of the things because, you know, but I don't want this to feel like it's, you know, kutuka mai, but I think it's good for us to address and identify some of these things because we're going to talk about something called the mother wound. And it's something that affects a lot of us, but because, again, we don't talk about these things because of societal standards, we end up just keeping quiet about it. Now, as I've mentioned, that our relationship was quite strained, so much so that I actually remember a moment where before I met and got married to my husband, I was engaged to someone else. And at some point we were going through a rocky season. And I was on the phone with her and we were talking about this, where I was just mentioning that I'm not so sure what's going on. And this guy had already been introduced to my family. I mean, let's not talk about the fact that I was 19. Story for another day. But he had already been introduced to my family. And in this rocky patch, I'm on a call with her and I'm just discussing just baseline to say, I'm not so sure what's going on. And then in that moment, she says to me, for your information, your dad was not the first person I was with. And I remember thinking, where is this coming from? What is this about? And now I reflect and I think it was in a way her giving me permission to move away from that relationship. To say, you don't have to stay in that relationship. But because we didn't have a history of talking about such matters, it just dropped from almost out of nowhere. And I think also it was her trying to connect, but I also just was looking for authenticity. I was looking for us to just have a conversation of what I was going through. But in that moment, I felt like she had personalized something that was an issue that I had. And I also had never thought that my dad was the first. It's not something that I thought about. It's not something I would sit there and think, oh, my mom and dad were each other's first. No, I don't think that some of us think about those things as much as sometimes our parents think we think about them, because I think they want to keep this impression that, they've managed to do the best that they can, and this false sense of, what we expect them to be. And sometimes that's not the case. And I feel like if we had had more conversations leading up to that, if we had had, sex talks leading up to that, the way that we talked about it in our previous episode, we wouldn't have gotten to a place where from nowhere, we've never spoken about sex, we've never spoken about, and then it's just dang, dang, dang. So it went from 0 to 100, and I didn't know how to process that. And so I think in her bid to reach out without some of the foundations that had been set up, I struggled in some of those moments. And in fact, I felt like that moment to me at that time put a bit of distance between us, because now I was afraid that if I was going to tell her something else, she's going to drop something else on me, and I actually wouldn't know how to navigate that conversation. You might be wondering why I'm giving some of these backstories if I'm dedicating this episode to my mom. Our relationship wasn't as close, so when she came back, I remember saying to her at some point, I don't think we can possibly relate as mother and daughter. I highly recommend we try to be friends. Let's start from there, because I felt that at some point I had to parent myself and work through some things on my own that at that time I felt I shouldn't have had to. And so I'm going to define what the mother wound is, because it will help us look into this portion a little bit better, and also just discuss a little bit on how our nervous systems develop. This is essential for us to understand how our bonds are created between parents and their children, and it will feed into how I responded to certain things further on. A mother wound is defined as pain that generates from dysfunctional, generational, emotional trauma that results from a dysfunctional relationship with our mothers. It manifests in different ways: people-pleasing, shame, just erratic behavior, even physical illness. And I think in my case, it manifests a lot in people-pleasing. There's a lot of things and sometimes some types of high functioning that happens as a compensatory behavior. One of the ways that mother wounds manifest as well is what would be called accelerated growth, where you end up having to parent oneself. Certain things that you do to take care of yourself that are not typical of you at that particular age. I remember being as young as 14 and doing things that I think I wasn't meant to do, but earning the term mother, where then I mothered people so much because I felt this absence. And so I would just then turn in and focus on that. And I know some people may be watching this episode where it's an aunt or someone and they're looking at it and they're thinking, well, but I was there in your life. I could mother you. But there's something about your own biological mother that, as much as society could be like, we're there, the mothers of the society, we're here, and that gap may not fill out in that way. Which brings me to defining how, or discussing how, our nervous systems form. So when we are born, our nervous systems are not fully developed, but we are aware of certain things. So a baby knows to cry when they're hungry. They know to cry when they want to sleep. And when we soothe the baby, we are training their nervous system to move from a place of fight or flight to rest, to trust. And so that's why you find that most of the time babies develop a particularly strong relationship with their mothers because they rely on them to help regulate their nervous systems. At a particular age, in collaboration with their bodies, they are communicating certain needs and their parents guide them in nurturing that. But at a particular age, you get to a place where you receive stimulus from other places. So let's say you go, and this is something that my nervous system coach speaks on, and we will dive deep into the nervous system coach situation and how I got to be in that place, because I think it all contributes much to this conversation about the mother wound and self-awareness and just celebrating being alive. So when you get to a certain age, let's say you're about 3 or 4, you go to playgroup, you go to nursery, and then there's so much going on, there's so much stimulation. You maybe get into a fight, wakikwa na uyo, uyaruta champiri gori, you want to try it and then you fail at it. And then you go home at the end of the day. You're so tired, you're frustrated. And then your mom says to you, it's time to eat. And you're like, but no rara. And at that age, you're probably going to throw a tantrum. And you're like, you're so tired, no rara. And you're like, no, eat. So your body is telling you that you're tired and you want to sleep. But your mom says you're hungry. And so what that does is it trains you to stop trusting your body slowly because you want to survive. So you're going to listen to your mom. So you're going to ignore the signals that have been telling you you want to sleep. And then that happens often enough to a place where we stop trusting ourselves entirely. So if something happens to our physique, we feel a bit of pain or whatever the case is, we train our nervous systems to respond a certain way. But that's usually typically guided by our primary caregivers who happen to be our parents. And so I thought I'd just give a bit of a backstory on these two concepts because I think they play a big role in how we develop. I'm going to rewind a little bit into the time early mid-90s, and I've spoken about this in our first episode, and part of the reason why I started officially Nyashaà. I had a traumatic experience happen to me at the hand of a cousin who was probably mid-teen, going into late teens, and it was child sexual abuse. And what happened was, when this happened, because I didn't have any understanding of what was going on and of how he communicated with me, I didn't speak to anyone about it. Now, we're going to fast forward to 2017 when my mom died. And when my mom died, it was 14 years and 11 days after my dad had died. You could say at that point, I'd gotten accustomed to losing a parent. I don't know if you could get used to it, but that's how I felt in that moment. And so when she passed on, I was doing well enough, and how it had happened is one of those things where I felt like I had the opportunity to see it coming. It wasn't a long illness, but where someone gets to the point where I don't think they're going to remain earthside at this point. And so when she passed on, a few weeks later, I remember breaking down, just being in a state, and I wept so hard. I remember wondering to myself, what's going on? Because of our relationship and how it had been strained, I didn't feel too strongly for me to feel like I needed to be grieving in this way. However, In that moment, I received this sense of revelation and understanding that what I was grieving was not particularly the loss of my mother, but I was grieving the fact that my mother died without knowing that I was sexually abused when I was 6. I was grieving that my parents had left this earth without having knowing that that had happened to me. I was grieving the fact that I felt that they hadn't done anything to avoid that situation happening to me. And so there was a lot of things that I was grieving in that moment, but her passing allowed for me to process that. And now that grief turned into anger. It turned into frustration, because now I'm thinking, both of these people are dead and I need to hold them accountable for what has happened. Now, remember earlier I spoke about how our nervous systems develop and looking at how our parents are the reason why we're earthside. Parenting is a very interesting concept because if you really think about it, this is two people coming together and creating a new human being. And by that account, when you look at what's defined as an orphan, you'd say it's someone who doesn't have parents. But that's kind of counter, because for you to exist, you need to have parents. So even if your parents die on the day that you're born, it almost doesn't bode, because you needed to have parents to have come earthside. And so by that account, I don't think we can truly define anyone as an orphan, because those two people created one person. And so also looking at that logic, that means that they still exist within me. Everything about me is a contribution of my parents. Everything, my eyes, my mouth, the way I respond to certain things and how my nervous system developed is a result of my parents. And so by that account, that is what I think we would consider legacy, how people continue to live on within other people. Now, understanding this will help us understand certain behaviors and things such as the mother wound. I've been wondering recently, and a couple of months ago, we had a special on Pink October, and it was also looking into the fight with breast cancer. And the research shows that women, of course, suffer way more from breast cancer. And our assumption is that because women have prominent breasts, not they just have breasts, because everybody has breasts, but women have prominent breasts. And so we assume that that issue is because of that. I actually think that the reason why as women we struggle with breast cancer is because we hold a lot of things in. And particularly holding in affects, because when you look at cancer, it is more physiological than it is physical. Studies have shown that cancers develop from that. And you find that that is why also they become hereditary, because a lot of the things that our parents carry are passed down onto us, whether it's habits, traits, behaviors, the whole nature versus nurture. And so you can carry genetic mutation to carry certain illnesses because of something that your mom went through. Now, understanding that has helped me understand my mom a little bit better, because I look at the way my life is set up and the things that I've had to experience as a woman in 2026, in a time where we feel that the world has progressed so much. Just 100 years ago, women couldn't vote. Just 50 years ago, women couldn't have bank accounts. And my mom this year would be 60, I think 66, somewhere there. I need to just really look at the math. No, 64. And so that means that at the time that she was born, women couldn't run marathons, women couldn't open bank accounts. Now, understanding the time that she grew up in and the expectation upon her, looking at the expectations that were upon me. I remember when I got married 12 years ago, within months I had leaders in communities, pastors saying stuff to me like, when are you going to get pregnant? Because we can't keep on calling you Nyashaà. We need you to have a baby so that we can call you Mainingi. When are you having a baby? When are you giving Ray a baby? All of this sort of dialogue. And this is in the 20 somethings. This is 2026. Now I'm looking back and wondering the things that Auxilia had to experience, the things that she had to work through, the things that she had to process without some of the tools that some of us have. About 10 years ago, due to the sexual trauma that I experienced, I developed some chronic conditions brought on by that. One of them was pelvic floor dysfunction. What my pelvis had become accustomed to was how to respond to certain things, and this was a way my body was protecting itself. It took a while for me to get a diagnosis. I also even have, I've got a certain relationship when it comes to gynaes, particularly female gynaes, because I had one gynae say to me, you're just going to have to accept that there's women like you. There's nothing that can be done. I think this is in your head. And I hadn't gotten a diagnosis. And thanks to this amazing doctor, God rest her soul, she passed on during COVID. She reached out to me and said, I think I can be of assistance. And if you could come to South Africa, we can talk through and I can refer you to someone. Finally got diagnosed and started working through certain things to get better. I started doing different exercises. I read so many books. I even had a surgery at some point to just help with the symptoms of the different things that I was experiencing. At some point last year, after feeling sick and tired of just having pain within my left hand, pain in my pelvis. And I remember at some point I actually used to say, oh, I carry stress in my left arm. A lot of us say that, like when we have a headache, and we say it almost feels like a sense of pride with it. And I just got into this place where I've been working out, I've been doing certain things, but I still feel this pain. So I went to get some tests done. And within getting those tests, happened to then discover that my body had healed of pelvic floor dysfunction. And I know at some point someone could be thinking, oh my gosh, that was a miracle. I will quickly just digress and say that a miracle is an inexplainable happening, an occurrence that happens just in like that, like you just healed. And I had been prayed over for this condition for years, but there was a lot of work put in, a lot of unpacking, a lot of working through trauma, breathing, different things like I've mentioned, surgery, to get to a place where my body healed of something that was considered chronic and would not go away. There was a lot of dialogue within my marriage on how we could navigate the situation. And so that was something that gave me hope that there's certain things that we can overcome that may seem like it's impractical, looking at the relationships that we have, looking at the dynamics that we have and the things that we carry, whether it's a cancer that then manifests physically or something that we carry and pass on to the next generation. So having this time of then reflecting on this and starting on the journey of healing my nervous system, I took it up a notch in how I view my mother and all the things that she has had to go through. And one of the reasons why I'm dedicating this episode to her is there's a lot of things and a lot of experiences that people share because of what they've gone through and the way they act because of what they've gone through. I now look at all the things that she did that I felt that she was doing wrong, and I realized that she was responding to what life had dealt her. She was responding to her reality, and she did what she knew best. And in that, each and every one of us has the opportunity to move on a path of not only forgiveness, but also a path of discovering oneself, because you have authority. You have autonomy over yourself. And so regardless of us staying in a world where you may be viewed a certain way, or people decide that you are set up a certain way because of where you come from or who you are. I'm here to share on my 37th birthday that you can come out of that and looking at the path that I've traveled. I always share that victims of sexual abuse, when I look at people who are prostitutes or people who have lives that people tend to judge and say, oh, this person is wayward, and think that they're just that way because they just have a Jezebel spirit, and not realize that there's so many things that would have happened to those people. It may not even have happened to them. It could have happened to their mother. I know of a girl who was raped in her teens, and she gave birth. And her daughter became a teenage mom. And typically you find in families where that happens, it continues. And no vatati, a familiar spirit, but not realizing the mother wound and the perpetuating of certain things due to how society views a particular family. And so we then say stuff like, "Cause I go in kupi, and stuff like that, and not realizing how that impacts people. But the good news is you can reject what people say about you. You can reject a viewpoint because it is not your responsibility to take on how people perceive you. You can only present who you are and be who you are, take steps within that journey, and how people receive and respond to you, that is not your burden to carry. And I had to learn that as a people pleaser, trying to compensate for not having my mom around and just actually be like, hey, I'm okay the way that I am. I am whole. I am loved. And the person who I held accountable for loving me unconditionally was also fighting their own battles. So I want to celebrate my mom. I want to thank her for bringing me earthside. We had to cut and do and do this last section again. As you can see, I did say it is going to be doesn't feel like a birthday episode, but I promise you it's giving birthday. If you know me, you know it's giving birthday. And we celebrate, we laugh, we cry and rejoice, all of that through the tears, because I think tears are a super expression, because you cry when you're joyful, you cry when you're sad, you cry when you're grieving, and just to be able to release all of that is a beautiful thing. And this is not just for women, because everybody has tear ducts. So don't be afraid for them to work and to be of use. Imagine if you just ate and never took a poop. So if you are absorbing everything and never release, you are emotionally constipated. So let yourself cry, let yourself feel all the feels. Thank you for watching this episode, which has been an interesting, a bit of a roller coaster. And some of the things that I touched on, we will come back and revisit these ones. But I just wanted to touch on this and to highlight this. And in celebrating my mom, it's celebrating that she lives on. She lives on in the joy. She lives on in even, I think, in the moments where we feel pain, where we feel certain things. I feel closer to her as I resonate in that. But I would love to feel closer to her in joyful moments, to feel closer to her in moments of laughter, regardless of the reality. And this is a call to anybody, to everybody, not just women, not just daughters, not just mothers, that you can be beyond what you expect it to be. And as I celebrate my birthday, I celebrate that my past doesn't have to determine my future. I celebrate my awakening, knowing I can be beyond what I was born to be, and that my past does not determine my future. And unfortunately, physically, though my mom is no longer earthside, to celebrate and to commemorate this moment, I want to dedicate this next segment to my mom. We're going to have a song, and this is the first time we're having this unofficially Nyashaà, so I hope you enjoy it. The song is by Msaki, this amazing, amazing artist, and it's called At the Stake. And reflecting on this song, and when I listen to it, I do feel the hurts and the pains of our mothers and all of that. And so I want to dedicate this song particularly to my mom. But what I also love about the song is how it ends. It ends in joy. It ends in celebration. And that's something to say about women. Through all of that, we're able to love. We're able to rejoice and still try and live our best lives. So happy birthday to me, and happy my birthday to you. See you next time. Please continue to like, share, and subscribe. Tell a friend to keep this official.
Burning at the stake is how the good ones go sometimes. Burning at the stake is how the good ones lose their lives. How they lose their burning at the stake is how the woman goes sometimes. Flaming at the neck is how the woman lose their lives. How we lose our lives, how we live our lives. What must we die? What must we die? When I hear your song, it pulls me out of the barrel. When I hear your song, I know that I'll be strong. What must we die? What must we die? When I hear your song, it pulls me out of my barrel. When I hear your song, I know that I'll be